Hi guys, it's Brooke. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video is just going to be a simple intro to color work. So if you're someone who's always thought color work is super pretty, but you're too nervous to start, this video is for you. I'm going to be going over all the details you need to know in order to be able to do color work as cute as this. So there are two different ways to do your color work. One way is called floating, which is the way I've done in this graph, where I've got all these strings hanging on the back of my work. Essentially, all this means is that when I got to this point, I dropped the orange and I worked only in pink, and then I picked the orange back up here, dropped the orange again, kept working, picked it back up here, dropped the orange again, kept working, picked it back up here, in order to use it on the other side so that I've got orange bordering this pink flower. So this, again, is called floating. Another way you can do your color work is by working over the yarn itself. As you can see on this scarf, I don't have any floats throughout my whole project. But if I pick it up and you look at it, you can see that I've got black running through the white rows. And the reason why is because as I'm working the white, I'm just working over that black yarn in order to keep using it on the other side. So this way I don't have the floats on my work because this is going to be a scarf. So I want it to be double-sided. So I don't want any of those ends hanging out. So in order to show y'all how to do color work today, I'm just going to be using two random things of yarn. And I'm going to be following this heart graph that I drew up really quick. I'm going to start off this video by just explaining how to work a graph and how to change colors. And then I'll go into more detail about the specific rules for color work for lefties and righties if you wanted to create your own graph. So to start this graph off, we're going to be doing a chain 14. For this graph, the first row is just plain single crochets. So I'm going to work my single crochets in, and I'm going to be going through the back bumps. So I'm going to pause here and talk a little bit about the difference between lefties and righties. So as a lefty, I just made my chain and now I'm going to single crochet back down it. And I'm going to be single crocheting from left to right. Now, if you're a righty, it's going to be the opposite. You're going to be single crocheting from right to left. So this is where the difficulties of different handed crocheters comes in when making graphs. If your graph is symmetrical, it doesn't matter if you're a lefty or a righty. And if your graph is not symmetrical, you will start facing problems with lefties and righties because they crochet backwards, but we'll go into that a little later. So now I'm just going to single crochet all the way across. So now I'm about to start the first row of color changing for this pattern. So in my graph, it says I need to have 6 stitches of white and then 1 stitch of red. So what I'm going to do is do 5 stitches in white, and then I'll come back and show you how to work the 6th. So I've just done 5 stitches. For color work, you always want to stop 1 stitch before you change colors in order to prepare for the color change itself. So now I've got my secondary color ready, and I'm going to start my 6th single crochet. I'm going to insert my hook through. I'm going to yarn over, pull through, and now I'm going to get my next color ready. So I've yarned over and I've pulled through. I'm going to pull this white taut because sometimes it's easy for it to become loose when you do this. I'm just going to pin it on the other side of my work with my finger. Hold it there while I grab my red. And I'm going to put my red right on top of the white back here, the way I've pinned it, and pin it with the hand holding my yarn. And now I'm just going to finish this stitch with the red. Yarn over, pull through 2. Now when you first do this, it's going to look a little stretched out, as you can see. So all I like to do is go back, hold my red down so I don't mess with it, and then pull on my white, and then pin them both together again. And now your stitch will look more taut. Now I've got 1 red stitch. So because it's just 1 red stitch, we're going to have to do the same technique again of switching back to our white. So I'm going to start my stitch as normal. I'm going to insert my hook, yarn over, pull through with my red. And now I need to grab my white. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pin my red back, pick my white back up, pin my red down to the back of my work. And now I'm going to yarn over, pull through 2 with my white. Now, as before, sometimes this stretches out a bit, so I'm going to pin my white down. And I'm going to give the red a nice pull to tighten it. Pick my white back up, and now we're ready to just continue single crocheting throughout the rest of the row. All right, this is what row 1 looks like. We've got 1 red stitch, which is the very tip of our heart. This is what the back looks like. When you're doing color work, it's really important to know which side is supposed to be your right side or your wrong side. For this example, the first row of color work, I'm just making the right side. So therefore, row 2, even rows will be the right side of the work. And then odd rows like row 3, which we're about to start, will be the wrong side. So this is where all our tails will be. When you buy a Colorwork pattern, it should tell you which side is going to be the right or the wrong side. And it's very important to follow this rule because if you change it, you could end up with a completely flipped graph. Now I'm going to chain 1 and start my next row. So for this next row, we're going to do 1 less single crochet. So we're going to do 5 single crochets total, which means I'm going to do 4 and then pause to prepare for my color change. Okay, so I've done my 4 single crochets and now we're getting ready to change colors. This stitch, the 5th, is going to be our last white, and then this white is going to be our red. So here is where you have basically a decision on how you would like to pick your yarn up for when you change colors. When the color change is just one difference, so it's just one addition of your secondary color, I like to do it this way. I like to insert my hook and start my stitch like normal, take my working yarn, pin it, grab my red, and then just finish the stitch like this. I try to do this pretty loosely because if you don't, your work will concave. The predicament with doing this is that you're left with this red bar on the back side of your work. So if you don't like this red bar, you don't have to do it. I just do it this way because I'm pretty lazy. And so if I did it this way, I would just continue by single crocheting in this next stitch, single crocheting in the following, and therefore covering up that red bar. Another way you can do it is by working over your red yarn in the transition stitch. I like to do this method when I'm, say, adding 3, 4, 5 red stitches. So what I would do is I would move my yarn in front of this white stitch right here, and I would work over it. So I would single crochet, right? And now I'm ready to change colors. So I'm going to pin my white down, pick up my red, and now my red is right here. Finish that stitch with the red. And it kind of hides that red bar. This is what it looks like from the front. And so then you could just keep single crocheting as normal to do these next 2 stitches in red. And this is what it looks like if you work over your yarn like that. And here's what it looks like from the front. So they're both good options. I really would recommend working over your yarn. Again, if you're going to add 2, 3, 4, 5 new stitches, it's just easier than pulling your yarn all the way across your work. So now we've got 1 more red stitch, which also means this red is the transition stitch. So now I'm going to do the same method I just did, where I'm going to work over the white yarn so that it's right here when I'm ready. So I'm going to single crochet, pin my red yarn down, pick up my white, and finish the stitch with the white. Now just do the rest of these single crochets as normal. All right, this is what row 2 of our work looks like. And here is the back. As you can see, it's really important to start to really pay attention, which is the right or wrong side of your work, because if this was the right side and I have this bar coming over, that's not cute. You want to make sure all your ends stick to the same side, which would be the wrong side of your work. As you can see, the tip of this heart isn't perfect, not as perfect as it says it should be in the graph. This is not an error on my part. This is just the way crocheting works. Your stitches have a lean to them, which is the reason why sometimes when you do graphs, there might be an empty space like here. So if I were to make this graph, I would fill in this stitch with red to make the point perfect. But if this is happening to you, just don't worry about it. It will happen. I'm going to explain at the end of my video when I talk about Colorwork rules, how to circumvent this issue and how to prevent it in the future. So I'm going to start row 4. I've only got 4 total white single crochets here. So I'm going to go till I hit 3. I've just done my 3rd single crochet and now I'm ready to change colors. So this time I'm just going to pick up my yarn. I'm not going to work over it because the stitches are so close together that I don't really care. So I'm going to insert my hook, yarn over, pull through, pin my white yarn to the back, pick up my red, and then just finish through with this red. And now I'm going to give my white a tug so that the stitch is taut. And now I'm just going to single crochet in the next stitch as normal, all the way across this red. All right, now I've got 1 more red stitch to go, which also means I need to transition to my white color. So now I'm going to work over the yarn. So I'm going to look to the back, grab this white, pin it to the stitch I'm going to be working through, pretty loosely, mind you. If you pin it too tight, your work is going to end up wavy because you're pulling on it too tight. So you want to make sure to give this some extra slack just in case. Now I'm going to insert my hook into this next stitch and work over this white yarn. Yarn over, pull through, pin my red to the back, pick up my white, yarn over, pull through a 2. Give my red a tug, and now I'm ready to finish the rest of this row with white stitches. All right, this is what our heart is looking like so far. And as you can see, as I mentioned earlier, this gap is just due to the way crochet stitches lean. This gap is for the same reason. Now I'm just going to kind of speed through the next few rows, just continuing to do what we've been doing so far. So now that we've done a few rows of floats, I'm going to show y'all how to work over your work if you decide to do that. It's completely up to you if you decide to do floating or working over your stitches. It doesn't really matter. It's just that in some cases, if you work over your stitches, like I did with my scarf, you're going to see the other color through it, versus if you float it, you won't see it, but then your back side is going to be a little more rough. So in this row, I'm just going to single crochet 2. And now I'm going to switch to my other color. Pick up my red. And now I'm going to work over my white as I go through these stitches. So I'm just going to hold my white in the back. And so every time I single crochet, I'm just single crocheting over that white. Another benefit of working over your secondary color is that when you're ready to switch, your color is right there with you, and so you don't have to pull it. It's a little easier sometimes. All right, and now I'm just going to finish this row. All right, so that was our first row of working over our yarn. Here's what the front looks like. And here's what the back looks like. As you can see, you don't have that float, and I actually worked over the float from the previous row as well, just for fun. So it completely covers up that white. Now I'm going to do another row of floats. So I've just got one white stitch this time. And now I'm just going to do my red stitches while working over my white yarn. One negative of working over your yarn instead of doing floats is that sometimes it's hard to see which is the right side or the wrong side while you're working on it. So that is another completed row of working over my white yarn. And here's what it looks like in the front. One thing I want to discuss before we keep going is you can see how my work is getting smaller. And the reason why is that when you change colors, it's really easy to make your tension extremely tight so that your stitches look really clean. And that's helpful, except for when you're doing a project and it starts to shrink. So this is something you should just keep in mind as you're doing color work. Another thing that I should have done is I should have sized down my hook for this foundation row, because you can see that these stitches are super loose compared to the color work itself. So often people do have to block their color work, or you just have to really keep in mind your tension as you're going in order to make sure it doesn't shrink. And this shrinkage of projects is especially the case when you're doing a really complicated graph. If you're doing just something large, a pretty big image like a giant flower on a pillow, probably not going to have this issue as much because you're not doing as many color changes. But say if you're doing a really intricate design with a bunch of rainbows, you're like switching colors every stitch, every other stitch, that's when you run the risk of your project shrinking. So I'm going to do another float row here because I want to talk about when you should be floating, especially if you're, say, doing what I'm doing now, where you've got a border around a bunch of stitches. So I'm going to start my row as normal. I'm going to transition to my red color, finish my single crochet. And now I'm going to start doing my red. Now it's recommended if you're switching colors over, 10, 15, 20 plus stitches to work to do a float every 5 stitches. So I'll show you what that means. So I'm going to do 5 stitches. 1, 2, 3. And on my 5th one, I'm going to float my white. So I'm going to single crochet over my white once, and now I'm going to do another 5 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, and now I'm on my 5th one. So now I'm going to insert my hook. I'm going to grab my white again, and I'm going to float it again. And now I'm going to switch to my white yarn to finish off the row. All right, here's what that row looks like from the front. Here's what it looks like from the back. So you see you've got 2 floats here. The reason why it's recommended to float every 5 stitches is because it's hard to judge tension if you're pulling from really far. So as you can see, I pulled way more than 5 stitches and even a couple rows up in order to work this yarn over and over again. And thankfully I've got some slack on it, so it's fine. But if I pulled too tightly, my work would be like this. It would be misshaping my work. It would be pulling it too tight. That's why it's recommended to float every 5 or so stitches. As you can see, I don't do it really consistently because now I kind of know how much slack I need. But when I'm doing it right, like this, you can see I'm floating in between this yellow circle here. So if you're wanting to float as a beginner, I would highly recommend floating every 5 stitches. So now I'm going to get ready to start the decrease for the heart. So I'm going to chain 1, and now I'm going to do 2 white single crochets. So I'm going to insert again, change color, 4 reds, 1, 2, 3, and then on my 4th, I'm going to float the white. And now I need 1 white stitch. So I'm going to single crochet once and then get ready to change colors to the red again. Now I'm going to do 4 reds again. And now I'm going to finish with my white, 2 single crochets. All right, now I'm just going to do the last row and come back. All right, so this is what our finished heart looks like. I'm super happy with it. I hope y'all enjoy yours as well. Now I'm just going to discuss some tips and tricks that I recommend when you're doing color work. So having just 2 colors for a little tapestry like this is perfectly fine because it's so small. But when you start making bigger projects where your color separation between 1 and 2 is, 20, 30, 40 stitches, I highly recommend having multiple small balls of yarn that you carry around for each side. So for example, for this project, this square had 1 ball of yellow and 1 ball of orange. This square had 1 ball of orange and 1 ball of pink. And this square had 1 ball of yellow and 1 ball of orange. I just highly recommend this because you're going to waste a lot of yarn if you're taking yellow from over here all the way to over here. So it's just easier if you have separate balls in order to work this graph. So people often wonder how colorwork designers deal with so many balls of yarn, like they're going to unravel, they're going to roll everywhere. So I'm going to tell you the trick that my friend Aiden taught me. You're going to take the yarn that you want to roll up, and instead of rolling it like this, what you're going to do is you're going to leave some excess for the inside yarn to pull out of, and then you're going to roll your ball like this. And I found that this was a little difficult at first, but now I've kind of got the hang of it. What will happen is you'll have this ball of yarn, and then you'll be able to pull from the inside. So this will be attached to your work, and this will be loose. And this method totally works. I highly recommend it. I was walking around with that flower tote and I had like 6 balls of yarn hanging off of it, and it worked great. So that's all there is to changing colors and actually crocheting a graph. If you're just a beginner who wanted some tips and tricks on how to change colors and stuff like that for a graph you've been seeing around, this is all you need to watch. But if you're someone who wants to start creating your own graphs, or if you're a pattern designer who wants to make sure your graphs are lefty and righty friendly and don't have some of these little holes and divots, if you want to make sure your graphs are perfect, keep watching and I'll explain how. So if you look up close at your graph, you'll find that sometimes your rows look like they're leaning a certain direction. This is what creates these gaps, is essentially when you're crocheting, your stitches are leaning to the left and leaning to the right. And so instead of being directly on top of each other like they are for knitting, they're skewed. So that's why you get these little gaps in your graphs. So in order to combat this, there are rules that you need to follow when creating your graphs in order to make it cohesive. Keep in mind that these rules, I wouldn't really use them for something huge. So for example, these are big graphics and I didn't necessarily follow the rules for color work, which is why, as you could tell, this petal has a little divot in it. But it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things because the graphic is so large. These color work rules are really important to follow when you're doing something really detailed. So for example, the design on this scarf is extremely detailed. The lines are a single stitch. So because of that, I had to follow the Colorwork rules. And this is what the correct side looks like. This is what the front looks like. And this is what the back looks like. As you can see, the back is a little more jagged and messed up, but the front is more clean. So any graph that you're following that has, say, a single line border or is really detailed, I highly recommend following these rules. So this is why sometimes when you're making graphs from pattern designers, maybe it looks clunky, maybe the curve isn't actually a curve, it's kind of more a square. The reason why is they're trying to fill in these gaps according to these Colorwork rules. So the rules are as follows. For righties, your even rows are going to be the wrong side of your work. Your odd rows are going to be the right side. And you're going to shift left on even rows and shift right on odd rows. For lefties, your odd rows are going to be the wrong side. Your even rows are going to be the right side. You're going to shift left on odd and shift right on even. Now let me describe what shifting is. Essentially, shifting is just increasing or decreasing with a specific color. So adding or losing a specific color. So for this graph on row 3, we shifted both right and left. And the shift right for row 3 looks nice because I kind of worked this as a right-handed. I flipped my rules as a lefty. As a righty, you are supposed to shift right on odd. So this is row 3. We did shift right, so it looks right. But when we shift left on row 3, there's a gap. So if I was creating this graph, what I would do is I would block in this stitch here as red to make it look cleaner. And even though this would make the graph look like the heart isn't as pointy, it would still fill in that space and make it look nice. So the audio in this next clip got super messed up. I don't really know how, but basically I ended up recreating the graph myself and then crocheting it myself. And you can automatically see the differences between the two. I don't really know which one I like better, but the one on the right has a little more gaps around the right side, whereas the one on the left doesn't. After making this, I would go through and make some changes. So this top left red stitch, I would make white. I would also whiten the bottom right and add a red stitch to the top right of the heart. Also maybe add some more white to the middle at the top to make that point really defined. But yeah, graphs are all about trial and error. Also, honestly, I probably shouldn't have even done the heart as an example for this video because hearts are really hard to make look nice in Colorwork because they're so rounded and they're so defined and it's hard to make round edges. When you're crocheting, it just is. If you blew this heart up and made it like triple the stitches, it would look absolutely perfect. But when you're making small things like this and it's really round, it's just hard to make the edges look perfect. It's really important to pay attention to these rules. If your graph is really detailed, if you're doing like a 1-stitch border, you want to make sure it's nice around that border. And especially if you're doing words, if your piece has words on it and you don't make a left-handed version, it's going to be completely messed up for the lefties. So that's why for all my patterns with graphs on them, I have a separate graph for the righties and the lefties. If you have any more questions on how to create a graph, please feel free to DM me. It's very confusing. I always redo my graphs multiple times usually, and that's why it's really important for me to have right-handed testers because I physically cannot make the right-handed graph. All right, that's going to be it for this video. Thank y'all so much for watching. I hope this gave you some insight on how to color change and do all things like that, but also how to create the graph yourself so you can make some really fun pieces. If you're interested in any more lefty tutorials, please check out my channel where I show different techniques for left-handed crocheters, and I've also got some pattern tutorials on there as well. Thanks, guys.